The conclusion, the perfection of renunciation. So, our translation reads, O son of Pritha, O conqueror of wealth, have you heard this with an attentive mind? Are your ignorance and illusion now dispelled? So there's a small purport. I'll read this and then I'll read the next verse. The Lord was acting as the spiritual master of Arjuna. Therefore, it was his duty to inquire from Arjuna whether he understood the whole Bhagavad-gita in its proper perspective. If not, the Lord was ready to re-explain any point, or the whole Bhagavad-gita, if so required. Actually, anyone who hears Bhagavad-gita from a bona fide spiritual master like Krishna or his representative will find that all his ignorance is dispelled. Bhagavad-gita is not an ordinary book written by a poet or fiction writer. It is spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Any person fortunate enough to hear these teachings from Krishna or his bona fide spiritual representative is sure to become a liberated person and get out of the darkness of ignorance. Kachit etat shrutam partha tvaya kagrena chetasa kachid jnana sammoha pranashtaste dhananjaya. O son of Pritha, O conqueror of wealth, have you heard this with an attentive mind? Are your ignorance and illusion now dispelled? So here's the next verse, 18.73. Arjuna uvacha nashto moha smritir labdha tvat prasadan mayachyuta stitosmi gata sandeha karishye vachanam tava. Arjuna said, my dear Krishna, O infallible one, my illusion is now gone. I have regained my memory by your mercy, and I am now firm and free from doubt, and am prepared to act according to your instructions. So this one's got a sizable purport. I'll read through it. Constitutional position of a living entity represented by Arjuna is that he has to act according to the order of the Supreme Lord. He is meant for self-discipline. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says that the actual position of the living entity is that of eternal servant of the Supreme Lord. Forgetting this principle, the living entity becomes conditioned by material nature. But in serving the Supreme Lord, he becomes a liberated servant of God. The living entity's constitutional position is to be the servitor. He has to serve either the illusory Maya or the Supreme Lord. If he serves the Lord, he is in his normal condition. But if he prefers to serve the illusory external energy, then certainly he will be in bondage. In illusion, the living entity is serving in this material world. He is bound by lust and desires. And yet he thinks himself the master of the world. This is called illusion. When a person is liberated, his illusion is over. And when he voluntarily surrenders unto the Supreme to act according to his desires, the last illusion, the last snare of Maya, the last illusion, the last snare of Maya to trap the living entity is the proposition that he is God. The living entity thinks that he is no longer a conditioned soul, but God. He is so unintelligent that he does not think that if he were God, how could he be in doubt? That he does not consider. So that is the last snare of illusion. Actually, to become free from the illusory energy is to understand Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and agree to act according to his order. The word moha is important in this verse. Moha refers to that which is opposed to knowledge. Actually, real knowledge is the understanding that every living being is eternally a servitor of the Lord. But instead of thinking oneself in that position, the living entity thinks that he is not a servant, that he is actually master of this material world, for he wants to lord it over the material nature. That is his illusion. This illusion can be overcome by the mercy of the Lord or by the mercy of the pure devotee. When that illusion is over, one agrees to act in Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness is acting according to Krishna's order. A conditioned soul, illusioned by the external energy of matter, does not know that the Supreme Lord is the Master, who is full of knowledge and who is the proprietor of everything. Whatever he desires, he can bestow upon his devotees. He is the friend of everyone, and he is especially inclined to his devotee. He is the controller of this material nature and of all living entities. He is also the controller of inexhaustible time. And he is full of all opulences and all potencies. The Supreme Personality of Godhead can even give himself to the devotee. One who does not know him is under the spell of illusion. He does not become a devotee, but a servitor of Maya. Arjuna, however, after hearing Bhagavad-gita from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, became free from all illusion. He could understand that Krishna was not only his friend, but the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And he understood Krishna factually. So to study Bhagavad-gita is to understand Krishna factually. When a person is in full knowledge, he naturally surrenders to Krishna. When Arjuna understood that it was Krishna's plan to reduce the unnecessary increase of population, he agreed to fight according to Krishna's desire. He again took up weapons, his arrows and bow, and rather, to fight under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Arjuna uvacha nashto moha smritir labdha tvat prasadan mayachyuta stitosmi gata sandeha karishye vachanam tava. Arjuna said, "My dear Krishna, O infallible one, my illusion is now gone. I have regained my memory by your mercy, and I am now free and firm. I am now firm and free from doubt, and prepared to act according to your instruction." So, what have you all decided after you finish the Bhagavad Gita? You're going to start again at, we don't know what Atma has planned. It's still a mystery. We'll know sometime next year. And the mystery will be solved. So, this last chapter is actually just a summary chapter anyway. The 18th chapter, like the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, both are summary chapters. So this chapter tries to put Bhagavad Gita into an entire encapsulation. So we learn something about spiritual life. And this is the nature of our thinking. One thing that I wanted to actually call into focus right at the very beginning is we look at this verse that I just read. Arjuna said, "My dear Krishna, O infallible one, my illusion is now gone. I have regained my memory by your mercy. I am now firm and free from doubt and prepared to act according to your instructions." So let's go back and back and back and back. We'll hit the rewind, and we go all the way back to chapter 2, verse 9. What does Arjuna say there? Sanjaya said, having spoken this, Arjuna, chastiser of enemies, told Krishna, "Govinda, I shall not fight," and fell silent. So just compare those two verses. The same Arjuna, separated by about 30 or 45 minutes worth of time, and in chapter 2, verse 9, he says, "I shall not fight." But chapter 18, verse, as we just read, 73, he says, "I am firm and free from doubt and prepared to act according to your instructions." So it's obvious that Arjuna has undergone a transformation. I bring this up because some people say that Krishna just spoke some interesting philosophy and Arjuna kind of took it in and okay. But this is a dramatic transformation. It's not that Arjuna just took it in. Arjuna was planning to skip out of the Battle of Kurukshetra because he felt it was unrighteous, that he would be implicated in sin if he engaged in the Battle of Kurukshetra. And this was his mood and determination. But in chapter 2, Arjuna puts himself in front of Krishna and asks Krishna to please instruct him. And Krishna does that in chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So Krishna instructs him in all those different chapters. And this is the end result. After hearing that discussion, which of course, I don't know how many, it's been several years, right, since you started the Bhagavad Gita. How many approximately? About 3 or 4?
Almost 9.
9. So it took us 9 years to get here. But it only took Arjuna about 45 minutes. So. But Arjuna was a good student. So Arjuna could pick it all up in about 45 minutes. So Arjuna heard the Bhagavad Gita, and he went from Govinda, I shall not fight, and falling silent, to now I am firm and free from doubt and prepared to act according to your instructions. And in chapter 2, he says, I am overcome by grief, and I cannot stand any longer, and my bow is slipping from my hand, and my skin is burning, and I'm in confusion. So in chapter 2 he says that, and here we have, by sharp contrast, in chapter 18 he says something very, very different. So it's obvious that Arjuna has had a complete change of heart. And the only thing that's happened is he's heard the words of Krishna and accepted them. And similarly, this can happen to any of us, that if we just hear the words of Krishna and accept them, we will also have a very strong change of heart. Our entire view of the world will change. However, we must hear from accredited or bona fide sources, from those who can understand the Bhagavad Gita as it's supposed to be, not in some concocted or some skewed version, which Prabhupada used to often caution everyone against. There are so many versions of Bhagavad Gita, but the reason that we don't recommend any of them is that the person who is explaining the Bhagavad Gita is not explaining it according to the actual nature or essence of the Bhagavad Gita. Such a person is not following in disciplic succession. Such a person has not studied the previous acharyas. Such a person is not living the Bhagavad Gita. So when they explain the Bhagavad Gita, what can they talk about it? They will undoubtedly distort the meaning of Bhagavad Gita. And that's why many people find the Bhagavad Gita a mysterious book. And indeed, it is very mysterious if you hear from the wrong sources. If you hear from the wrong sources, Bhagavad Gita will mostly not make any sense. Usually we'll find 1 or 2 chapters that the person explaining the Bhagavad Gita will do a reasonable job of giving some explanation of. But the whole rest of the Bhagavad Gita will be like a mystery. It'll be dark. It'll be unknowable. And in many cases we find that the rest of the Bhagavad Gita is not even presented completely. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was very famous for translating the Bhagavad Gita up to the 6th chapter. What happened to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18? What happened to the rest of it? Well, he said he would get around to it, he promised, but sadly he's no longer alive. So I don't think that he'll ever get around to doing the rest of it. And I've told this story before that many years ago I was in Chicago, Illinois, and I was doing Sankirtan, and I was riding the subway back to Rogers Park from downtown, the Loop. And as I got off the subway station in Chicago, there was a bookstore underneath the subway. And I went in there, and I just thought, well, let me take a look at what they have as spiritual books. And there I saw it, Bhagavad-gita As It Was. Really, Bhagavad-gita As It Was. I've heard of Bhagavad-gita As It Is. Prabhupada wrote that. Here was Bhagavad-gita As It Was. And this one went to about chapter 10 or something like that, and then decided that that was enough. The rest of it didn't really matter, or maybe they'll get around to it, when they get some free time. Something came up and they only could do a certain portion of it. So again, this is what we usually find, even if the person does in fact do a version of each verse, all 700 verses of the Bhagavad Gita, still we'll discover that some parts of it make a little bit of sense and other parts of it are completely dark. But when I came across Prabhupada's explanation and the way the devotees explained it, the Bhagavad Gita just makes straight ahead sense. It's a book about devotion. If you try to read it in some other way, you're going to have trouble because it just won't shine all the way through. It'll start to seem like something else. It will not seem like the Bhagavad Gita, and you'll have to dance around certain chapters in a very awkward and strange way to try to fit them into some other perspective. The only perspective that the Bhagavad Gita makes sense, the only way that it actually holds together cohesively as a single thing, is by seeing it as a description of bhakti. And aside from some people saying that Arjuna was supposed to be a yogi, I mean, you'll hear people say that kind of thing. And indeed, there are several kinds of yoga described in Bhagavad Gita. But Prabhupada always points out the fact that Arjuna, after hearing the Bhagavad Gita, did not go into the forest into the lotus position. He got on the chariot with his bow and arrow in his hand, which is a very different kind of yoga. It was not the kind of yoga that people generally think of as yoga. So why did he do that? Well, as we see here, in chapter 2, he's saying he's not going to fight. In chapter 18, he's saying he will act according to Krishna's instruction, which is Krishna's told him to fight. So why has he changed his mind? The answer is because he is doing yoga, but not hatha yoga. He's doing a different kind of yoga. And what yoga is that? We go back to the 6th chapter. And in 6th chapter, we see that Krishna has built up from chapter 3, 4, 5. He's talked about various kinds of yoga, karma yoga. He's talked about jnana yoga. He's talked about buddhi yoga. He's talked about dhyana yoga. He's talked about ashtanga yoga. And finally, in the end of chapter 6, he tells Arjuna, be a yogi. Okay, so why isn't Arjuna meditating then? The answer is, if you go to the next to the last verse of chapter 6, you will hear tapas vibhyo diko yogi jnanebhyo pi mato dikaha karmebhyas chadiko yogi tasmad yogi bhavarjuna. Yogi is greater than the ascetic, greater than the empiricist, greater than the fruitive worker. Therefore, Arjuna, in all circumstances, be a yogi. So Krishna is telling him directly right there to be a yogi. So why didn't Arjuna meditate? Well, let's find out what kind of yogi. he's supposed to be. And in the next verse, we hear, Yoginam api sarveshan madgatenam taratmanam shradavan bhajate yoma sameyuktatmo mata. Of all yogis, the one with great faith who always abides in me, thinking of me within himself, renders transcendental loving service to me, he is the most intimately united with me in yoga and is the highest of all. That is my opinion. So in the last two verses of chapter 6, Krishna does not leave it up to Arjuna to do whatever kind of yoga Arjuna resonates to. Instead, he's telling him something very specific. And we hear this idea all through the Bhagavad-gita that he's not supposed to withdraw from the world the way yogis usually do. Rather, he's supposed to act in the world, but act according to Krishna's desire, not according to his own desire. So that's, in one sense, in a nutshell, the message of Bhagavad-gita. One is not supposed to refrain from action, but one is actually supposed to act, but for the pleasure of Krishna. And that kind of yogi is not the hatha yogi or the astanga yogi. Such a yogi is the bhakti yogi. Thinking of him within himself. What kind of yogi does that? Well, many kinds of yogis do that. But rendering transcendental loving service, when you're in meditation, you're not rendering service. You are in meditation. So the idea of doing service, that is bhakti yoga. So I wanted to start off with these 2 points. But here we have Bhagavad-gita. We're wrapping it up now. We're putting the final touches on it. We are hearing the epilogue. In a minute, we just heard Arjuna speak. In a minute, we'll hear Sanjaya speak. And then, the national anthem will play and the television screen will go black. But that's the way the Bhagavad-gita ends. There's nothing much left. In fact, Prabhupada says the Bhagavad-gita was already finished in 17 chapters. But this 18th chapter is a summary. And Prabhupada tells us that just like the second chapter, it's a summary, but in the 18th chapter, one extra thing gets added that's not there in the second chapter, and that's a summary of all the instructions that Krishna gave to Arjuna in the Bhagavad-gita. Now, where does he do that? Well, if you notice, at the beginning of chapter 18, Krishna rehashes the process of karma. Then he rehashes the process of jnana. Then he talks about the yoga ladder. And in this way, we go back over the entire description of what he wants Arjuna to do that he described in the entire rest of the Bhagavad-gita. So things are rehashed. First there is a rehash of karma, then a rehash of jnana, then a rehash of the yoga ladder. So the yoga ladder is a gradual ladder of progressive knowledge. And in this way, Krishna recapitulates the entire Bhagavad-gita, the whole rest of it, in chapter 18. And then at the very end of it, the verse that I first read, which was 1872, he puts himself across very simply. Even though he's the Supreme Lord, he says, have you heard with an attentive mind? Are your ignorance and illusion now dispelled? So, where does he say? Somewhere he says that do what? Yeah. do as you desire. So Krishna never forces anyone to do what Krishna wants. Now, why would Krishna not force people to do what he wants? Krishna could certainly do that. But there would be no such thing as free will. And without free will, there would be no love. So if we were forced to serve Krishna, then we would be like robots or something. We would not be able to, out of our own free agency, turn our consciousness toward Krishna. We would be forced to do it. So Krishna never forces. If we want to stay here and rot in this material world, Krishna will not stop us. Of course, it's not a really pleasant option, but a lot of people will decide on it for one reason or another. And most people don't know that there's not another option. But if you want to stay here, be my guest. Krishna will allow it, and Krishna will never force you to leave. But you'll just get kicked around like a football. One lifetime after another, after another, after another. And one day we finally wake up and think, hey, I'm done with this. And when that happens, we begin devotional service. So these were the basic points that I wanted to first make in my first sort of outlay of what I wanted to discuss on this back end of Bhagavad-gita, this idea that certainly Arjuna underwent a transformation, that there was certainly no ambivalency. Arjuna did not ho and hum and, well, let me think about it, I'll get back with you. Give me your email. You know, he didn't say that to Krishna. He had a resolute understanding, and he and Krishna were on the same page, and they weren't on the same page when they started. The second point that I wanted to make was that Krishna did not leave a smorgasbord of options for Arjuna. He certainly did discuss various yogas, there's no doubt about that. But at the end of chapter 6, he finally narrows his options down to what he actually wants Arjuna to really do. He talks about these other things, but he never recommends them. Rather, he recommends, in all cases, better than the jnani, better than the karmi, better than the tapasvi, one should be a yogi. And then we learn what kind of yogi he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be a bhakti yogi, not a jnani yogi. He's supposed to be a bhakti yogi. He's not supposed to be an astanga yogi. All right. So, questions about any of that? Yes.
So, over the years, I've heard and read the Bhagavad Gita a few times. I try to do it attentively. I accept intellectually the what's being presented, the worldview, the idea I'm supposed to surrender, but somehow I can't get my behavior in line. And then Arjuna said, yes, I accept, and then he just acted as Krishna wanted. But I don't find it that easy just to act as Krishna. What to do?
Yeah. That's the interesting part about devotional service. That on the heels of finally, we bump around in this ridiculous material world so many lifetimes. We try this, we try that. Nothing ever works. It's kind of like, a person looking through a junkyard, for something valuable. And he's looking at, an old broken television set. Then he's looking at an old shoe. Then, he sees some smelly garbage and puts that out of the way. Then he sees some auto parts, and he's going through this ridiculous, endless succession of things. Finally finds a diamond, he just throws that away too. So it's just like, we don't really know what we're looking for. And when we find it, oftentimes we just think, oh, this is what I was looking for. Oh, let me look again at something else. We're just so into the motion of looking at things, rejecting stuff, that we don't even stop to consider that we have actually found something. Now, sometimes we do. We stop and consider that we've actually found something. And then immediately realization too hits. We've found what we were looking for. We've actually understood what this universe is. a real explanation that actually makes sense. But then we realize, uh-oh, but I'm a junkie. I'm still connected to this material world. And although I know what to do, it's not at all easy. You know, I theoretically am prepared to act according to your instructions, Arjuna, but I find that many times I just kind of miss the mark. I start out in the right direction, but somehow or other I'm diverted. And so this is the process that we call rising in the modes. We were talking about this last Saturday, the poem program that I was doing. In the 7th chapter of Bhagavad-gita, we hear that one has to rise above the modes. So even though we know the right thing, we don't do the right thing because we're habituated wrongly. And this is what Prabhupada called our conditioned nature. It's not just one lifetime, but countless lifetimes, we have been doing the wrong thing. Of course, to our credit, we're not doing the same wrong thing. We do new wrong things, just to give it variety, so we're not doing the same wrong thing all the time. And we do some repeats of some wrong things, so those become our bad habits, and those go so deep that when we come out of the womb already, we're ready to launch into another tailspin lifespan where we'll go crash into the ocean, you know. But this is the fact that the modes of nature are pushing us according to the ill deeds and ill-considered choices of our past lives. So we've done the wrong thing in the past, and we tend to do again the wrong thing. But not to worry. Devotional service is so powerful that though we are very forced, very steeped in doing the wrong thing, by a continual application of devotional service, gradually our tendency to do the wrong thing will diminish. Our tendency to be foolishly locked in to the wrong course of action, the wrong goals, that will all fade. And eventually we'll discover that, hey, I'm doing this Krishna consciousness, and you know what? Strange enough, I like it. I'm not at all forced to do this. I feel happy. And I feel that for the first time, my mind is not swirling in a hurricane of wrong feelings and confusion like Arjuna was in chapter 2. I'm finally coming out of it. This means the modes are gradually being removed from our consciousness. And when the modes are removed, the world looks different. I talk about it sometimes using the analogy of being on a merry-go-round. If you're on a merry-go-round and you're spinning and you're trying to read something that's on the wall, you know, you're trying to catch it, but you're spinning and your eyes can't lock onto it. You can't read it very well. And you might even toss your cookies if you're trying to read it too carefully while you're spinning around on a merry-go-round. If you're in a hurricane, the entire world is spinning around you. And if your world is spinning around, then there's dust and debris and you can't actually see things clearly. If you're looking at a map to understand where you are in a particular city, but the map has an overlay of 2 or 3 maps, and they're different cities, and they're overlaid on one another, you also can't figure out which street goes with which city, and which one that you're in, which one you should be looking at. And in this way, this is the way the world appears to us when we're chapter 2'd. But when we finally become chapter 18, then things look very different to us at that point. When we get to chapter 18, we are no longer looking at several maps overlaid on one another. The merry-go-round has stopped, and the hurricane has died down. So at that point, things are clearer, And the tendency to do the right thing is easier. And so this is the nature of the material world and the process of purification. Through the process of purification, we will gradually begin to see the world as it is and be able to act as we should, not just think as we should, but also act as we should. Through the continual application and reapplication of Krishna consciousness, we go from devotional service mixed with the modes of passion and ignorance to devotional service mixed with passion and goodness to devotional service, period. Unalloyed devotional service. So this is how it gradually purifies us. Other questions or comments or realization? Yes.
I'm wondering if this will go along with it. If you'd speak more about, I've regained my memory in verse 13.
In which one?
73, I'm sorry.
73.
I've regained my memory.
Yeah.
As opposed to, say, understanding or...
Yeah, well, he's regained his memory of who he is and what he's really doing. We have there's this wonderful word, actually it's a compound word, false ego. In Sanskrit it's not a compound, it's a single word, ahankara. But this false ego means that we are identified with something that we are not. And because we're identified with an illusion, then certain things don't work. You know, if you have a false or fictitious understanding of what environment you're in, you'll discover that certain things just don't work. But when you disidentify with this false understanding and you identify with the correct understanding, then everything starts to work again. So Arjuna, due to emotional factors, we have to understand why is Arjuna having difficulty. Because in chapter 2, Krishna has just finished in chapter 1 showing him the contestants on the other side of the battlefield, his relatives, the Kurus. And besides that, he showed him Bhishma Dev and he showed him, Drona and others that he had a lot of affection for. And he knows he's got to fight them. And so he's emotionally torn at this point. He's not just on a battlefield fighting people he has no relationship with, which is usually what happens in a war. In most wars, you're fighting some enemy that you don't know by first name and you have no connection with. But in this case, he's fighting his relatives. He knows them. And even though he's not particularly affectionate towards Duryodhan, still he knows Duryodhan. Duryodhan is a relative. But he is affectionate toward Bhishma Dev and Drona, and he knows he has to fight them. So all of a sudden there is an emotional reason for wanting to duck out of the battle. And so he's identifying with being part of a family instead of identifying with being a soul, instead of identifying with having a role to play in both social settings, being a kshatriya, someone who's supposed to uphold the law, and also being a divine being, a servant of the Supreme Lord. So in both of those points of view, he is doing the wrong thing. When he thinks of himself in the sense of being part of a social family and having nice, warm relations with one's relatives, by ducking out of the fight, he thinks he's doing the right thing. So in that map, he's doing the right thing. But in the other two maps, he's doing the wrong thing. And so Krishna is awakening his memory of the other two maps, that he is a living entity and he's supposed to serve the Supreme. He's awakening him to the fact that he's a kshatriya, and a kshatriya is supposed to uphold the law, what's actually right. And even though these people who are doing the wrong thing are his relatives, that doesn't excuse them. So this is kind of what we mean by is awakening Arjuna's memory of who he really is and what his duty really is, not the duty of trying to maintain good relationships with relatives, but the duty of being a kshatriya, the duty of being a servant of the Supreme. Other questions or realizations?
I wonder if you would just take a moment to expound on the power of devotional service and types of devotional service that we may not know about. Like, is it only spectator or a participant? Or if you could just expound on that a little bit more.
Well, most of the devotional service I know is transitive. It's all active. We do something. The idea of devotional service, there are 9 types, and this is listed in 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. In the story of Prahlad Maharaj, it's in the 8th chapter, I believe, the 7th canto. Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu Smaranam Padasevanam Archanam Vandanam Dasyam Sakyam Atmanivedana Iti Plum Sarpita Vishnu Bhaktas Chen Navalakshana Kriyate Bhagavati Adda Tanmanye Dihitamuttamam. So these 2 verses are the reply that Prahlad Maharaj gives to his father Hiranyakashipu when Hiranyakashipu asks him what's the best thing he learned in school. So this is kind of a typical thing that a parent will ask their child, but Hiranyakashipu thought that Prahlad would answer something cute, being a 5-year-old boy, but instead he answered something profound, and worse than that, he answered the process of devotional service, which his father Hiranyakashipu had absolutely no interest in and was diametrically opposed to. So it incensed his father. And the 9 processes of devotional service are Shravanam, hearing, Kirtanam, chanting, Vishnu Smaranam, remembering the Supreme Lord, Padasevanam, serving the Supreme Lord, Archanam, which is performing puja or worship, Vandanam, offering prayers, Dasyam, becoming a servant, Sakyam, becoming a friend, and Atmanivedana, which is giving up everything for the Supreme. So these 9 kinds of devotional service are the types of devotional service that will, any one of them or any combination of them will deliver us ultimately from the bad habits of many lifetimes. So most of them are active. Well, chanting, that's an activity done by the tongue. We're talking about, an active activity where we're speaking and we're hearing, so that's an action. Kirtanam, which is, or Shravanam, is hearing, first of all. That seems like a passive activity, I guess you could call it that. Kirtanam is active, we're speaking. Vishnu Smaranam, we're remembering. That's also somewhat passive, but it's actually not so passive when you realize how difficult it is to focus your mind on the Supreme Lord for any significant length of time. And then service, which is what we call Padasevanam, doing some kind of practical service to the Supreme Lord. Archanam, doing some, that's certainly active, doing some deity worship. That's also active. Vandanam, offering prayers. In one sense, that's also active. It's not what we usually think of in the sense of normal, everyday activity, but it certainly requires a focus of attention and a focus of intention. So that's what, so I would say most of these 9 types of devotional service are active in some sense. Some of them may seem somewhat passive, but by the process that we know of as Pancharatrika Vidhi, there is a collection of techniques that taken together we call the Bhakti Yoga process. And so therefore, throughout the course of a day, we usually don't focus on just one kind of devotional service, but we sort of segue through a number of different kinds of devotional service, and in this way, our minds, because they tend not to be able to focus on any one thing for very long, they tend to be able to handle that. At one point we are hearing, at one point we're chanting, another point we're serving, another point we're chanting, another point we're doing some deity worship, another point we're doing some other kind of practical service. And so therefore we kind of move throughout the course of the day following different activities, all of which are one form or another devotional service. But any one form of devotional service is sufficient in itself. However, most usually find that they can't focus on just one, so that's why we recommend just doing one, but a succession of different types of devotional service. Yes, Lily.
Before my question, just a comment, and that is, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya asks Lord Chaitanya, of the 9 processes, which are the most important? And Lord Chaitanya replies, hearing and chanting. So even though they can all grant, perfection, especially in this age, hearing and chanting, and Jiva Goswami writes in his Sats and Darbas that all the other processes of devotional service should be accompanied by hearing and chanting. And now my question is, you mentioned that the yogi who meditates, he's not doing service.
That's right.
But remembering Vishnu, that's what he's doing.
Right.
So is he doing service in that way?
Well, yes. This is one of those questions that has that wonderful answer of yes and no. And there are a lot of questions in devotional service that have that answer, yes and no, depending on exactly what you mean. The rasa of Shanta Ras, which is the yogi's rasa of meditating, is, according to some, accepted as a kind of service and a kind of genuine relationship with the Supreme. But others do not think of it that way because it's not active. So generally when we think of service, there is some motion, there's some volition, there's some choice, there's some activity, which are all missing. However, it is indeed considered a type of devotional service, a type of rasa, at least by some. This gets into a point that I was going to bring up in my next section, so I'll just get into it at this stage, is this idea that we hear over and over again of confidential, more confidential, and most confidential knowledge. So this is a theme that we hear echoed, and here in the last part of the first verse of the 18th chapter, and also here in the last part of the 18th chapter, we hear about this confidential knowledge. Krishna is always talking about this. Guhyam, which means confidential. So what does he mean? Confidential, more confidential, most confidential. So at one point, Prabhupada in the purport says that confidential means one understands the Brahman, one understands that the Supreme is all one. More confidential means one understands the Paramatma, or the Supreme within the heart. And most confidential is where one understands the Bhagavan, or the personal feature of God, and serves that feature. So these are progressive stages. If one understands God in some way or another, that's good, but there are progressive higher and more intimate stages of understanding God, which are better than those that are not quite so advanced. So that's one way that Prabhupada is giving us an understanding of what we mean by confidential, more confidential, and most confidential. But yet there's another way that Prabhupada describes it, and he describes confidential as being understanding the basic rules and regulations of Scripture. That's confidential. And then he describes more confidential is trying to engage in some kinds of activities that are aimed at understanding the mystery of the universe. And finally, most confidential is where there's no mystery anymore. that mystery of what is the universe becomes not a mystery anymore. It's a person. He's called Krishna. And what we're supposed to do is serve Krishna, and that's most confidential. So we see this gradual progression of stages of deeper realization. And naturally, there's no reason to stay at some lower stage. And in the Bhagavad-gita and in the Vaishnava literatures, we have why we should focus on the highest stage, which is understanding the Supreme, understanding His name, and serving the Supreme. And that's what Prabhupada says is surrender. And that's what Prabhupada says Krishna consciousness is, doing what the Supreme wants. And that's what Arjuna has just decided to do. In chapter 2, he decided not to do it. And in chapter 18, here in verse 73, he's decided to do it. So that's the idea, that when one serves the Supreme, one is on the highest level. And higher is that person who is serving the Supreme than the person who just meditates. Higher is he than the person who is just searching for what the mystery is behind the universe. And he's also higher still even than that person who simply follows some rules and regulations or understands the all-one, which is the lowest tier of the sort of God realization, echelon. Yeah.
So among those 9 path of bhaktis, how important it is reading scriptures?
What's that?
Reading scriptures?
Reading scriptures. Well, reading scriptures is very important in the beginning, because when we start the process of bhakti yoga, unless we clearly know what we're doing, we're going to be shunted or diverted to some facsimile of the process of devotion, and a facsimile that has some serious flaw. And that's why we study. Ultimately, there's verses that say when one is fully engaged in devotional life and one's heart is attached to the Supreme, then one can run with both eyes closed. One does not need scriptures or anything, or rules. And indeed, the great advanced devotees are like that. But that is something you can only say of a person whose heart is completely purified. The rest of us, we do need rules and regulations, and we can't run with both eyes closed. So we need the ideas to keep us on the right track. And so this is why reading devotional service, to know clearly what it is and what it isn't, is very important. Because one can be diverted either to an offensive understanding, or one can start having an impersonal understanding, or one can be lost in some basically pseudo-religious type of mode of goodness behavior, which is nice, but it's not devotional service. It's not pure devotional service, and therefore will not in the long run really purify us. So that's why we all have a hunch of what devotional service is, but oftentimes that's not quite good enough. That there come times and places and circumstances where if we don't really know in a clearly spelled out way what we're doing and what we're avoiding, we may make the wrong choices. And that's why reading scriptures is very important. That, through the process of hearing from the acharyas, hearing from the authorized literature, trying to understand them, then we understand what we're really trying to do. For instance, if someone engages in devotional service but doesn't know about offenses, one can certainly be doing devotional service, but one is also simultaneously offensive. And if we don't understand what the offenses are, we continue to make them. And eventually our devotional service will become ruined by the fact that we're performing it in an offensive manner. And that's one of the reasons why we need to have a clear understanding of what offenses are and how to avoid them. Does that make sense?
Jiva Goswami makes an important point in this regard. He says that if we just read the scriptures ourselves, we'll be taking it through the filter of our mind and not come necessarily to the proper conclusion. Therefore, we need the guidance of a pure soul, an acharya, to even understand the scripture.
Right.
So I say there has to be the two tracks. The scriptures are there, and also that's why the Bhagavad-gita As It Is so good, because you get the scripture and Prabhupada's direct,
Right.
so we understand what it is.
And even then we have the association of other devotees.
Yeah.
So the problem with all scriptures is that words can be ambivalent. Most words can have more than one meaning. And therefore, if words can have more than one meaning, a phrase can have more than one reading. And in the Vedic literature, this is exploited. And sometimes we see that the same verse is translated in 3 or 4 very different ways, which are all acceptable meanings of the individual words, though they are not equivalent to one another. They're actually different meanings, but they're all acceptable. But there are some meanings when we put together a group of words that have multiple meanings that are unacceptable. And the reason they're unacceptable is they violate the overall central thread that ties together the whole process. We call that technically in Sanskrit the Siddhanta. So the Siddhanta is what cues us in that what we think we've read is either correct or not. And in the beginning, we don't have such a strong hold on what that is. But over the years, if we are learning the process of reading Bhagavad-gita or Bhagavatam or any of the Vedic literatures, through the help and agency of those who have studied them under the help and guidance of a superior authority themselves, then they'll have one solid conclusion, and they can immediately recognize when a student has a misunderstanding. The student imagines that they've understood what the literature is saying, but they've actually misunderstood. And this is what the benefit is of the acharyas of the previous parampara, and of having, as Murli is saying there, the book Bhagavat and the devotee Bhagavat. So we're reading the books, so we know that the devotees aren't making stuff up off the top of their head, because what they're saying is the same as what we read in the books. But at the same time, when we run into something we don't understand in the book, we go to those same devotees who clarify what it means and what it doesn't mean. So this way we have actually 3 items or 3 pillars that help us to redundantly focus on what is actually the genuine purport of the scriptures, and that is the scriptures themselves, the guru, and the sadhus. So if what we think we understand out of the scripture is the same thing that the guru says he understands, and it's the same thing that the community of devotees of a certain strain or a certain community of a certain understanding also agree on, then we know we have the right thing. But if the spiritual master is saying something that's not in the book, then we've got a problem. If we're hearing something that we are misconstruing in some way, and others tell us that it's not the right understanding, then we've got a problem. If we are in with a group of people who all have the same conclusion, but that conclusion is different from what's in the scripture, we've also got a problem. So that's why we have these 3 things: Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. There's 3 ways, 3 independent channels by which we corroborate the same ultimate conclusion. And if we have the same conclusion from each of those three sources, then we have what's called the Siddhanta. So this is why we have to hear in the association of Vaishnavas. And after some time, then we ourselves will be able to more easily tell when we have the right understanding or the wrong understanding. And scriptures, it's easy to have the wrong understanding. And that's why people who try to understand the Vedic literatures without the help of a spiritual master or some Vaishnava parampara or group, such a person will become hopelessly confused in time, because they will read and they will misunderstand, and there will be no one to tell them that what they think they understood is actually a misunderstanding. And these misunderstandings will pile up over time, and a person will be comfortable and used to their own misunderstandings. And so when somebody tries to unsettle those misunderstandings, they will tend to reject that. And in this way, a person will miss the right path and, as the scriptures say, fall into a ditch.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
For a lay person, would you please explain the difference between the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad-gita?
Yeah. Well, Bhagavat means one who possesses opulences. So the Bhagavad-gita means the song of God, the one who has many opulences. So that's what Bhagavad-gita means, because it's Krishna's speech to Arjuna. That's why it's called the Bhagavad-gita. And this same word gets used in reference to the Supreme Lord. He's called Bhagavan, or the possessor of all opulences. We all have some opulences, but only the Supreme Lord Krishna has all 6 opulences in full: wealth, strength, beauty, fame, knowledge, and renunciation. Only he has all 6 of them in full. We have maybe 1 or 2 of them, if that, and in a very minute proportion. So a person who has all types of opulences is called Bhagavan. And this same word gets used in some of these other compounds, like Bhagavad-gita or Bhagavan or Srimad Bhagavatam. These words are utilized in a slightly different way. But basically that's what it refers to. Other questions or realizations? If not, I'll move into another final section. I think we've got some more time. We're supposed to end here at 7:30. Yeah. Is it 8:15? No, we've still got a few minutes. So we see that the Bhagavad Gita, its main theme, or its main purpose, is simply to try to convince all of us to do what Krishna is asking us to do. Krishna's not forcing us to do it, but if we do it, we'll discover that life will have meaning, that our consciousness will come out of the dark forest, that we'll feel happy. And if we don't do it, we will chase various illusions through this life and many other lives and never feel any kind of real happiness, and we'll never feel any kind of real relief. We'll always feel very put upon. So that's the nature of this whole idea of Bhagavad-gita. That's what Bhagavad-gita is intended for us to come up with after hearing it and reading it. All 18 chapters. We're winding up here, and at this point, Krishna has just asked Arjuna, I've told you what I wanted to say. Now you think about it and you do what you want to do. And Arjuna says, well, I know what I want to do now. I want to do what you say. So that's the right attitude. And then you'll see that later on through the rest of what's left of this chapter, and there's only about 6 or 7 verses left, we see that, it just winds up with Sanjaya, and he's speaking to Dhritarashtra, and winding it up just like we opened with the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, with Sanjaya speaking to Dhritarashtra. And now we're going to close up the same way with Sanjaya speaking to Dhritarashtra. Of course, Dhritarashtra is not going to take this seriously at this point. However, in Bhagavatam, we learned that after the battle of Kurukshetra, when all of his children are killed, and after Vidura comes back, Vidura does preach to Dhritarashtra, and Dhritarashtra does finally undertake the process of spiritual life. Maybe not the highest path of spiritual life, but he does undertake the process of spiritual life, and does the right thing toward the end of his life. So that's something that gets told in Srimad Bhagavatam in the first canto. Around 13th, 14th chapter, we hear about Dhritarashtra leaving the Pandava household and going into the Himalayas to meditate, which he does. So at this point, this is before the battle of Kurukshetra has happened, so he's in no mind to do that at this stage. But he's also heard the Bhagavad Gita through the lips of Sanjaya, but it did not have the effect on him that it had on Arjuna. Yeah.
I'm new in Krishna consciousness, and
Uh-huh.
also I'm trying to read and participate in classes like this. So I'm a bit confused regarding my understanding of Bhagavad Gita. So Arjuna refused to fight, and then Krishna tells him by different chapters in Bhagavad Gita.
Mm-hmm.
So in summary, what I understood is your duty, you are Kshatriya, and your duty is to fight, you should fight. So those days we had a Varna system, Brahmana, Kshatriyas, and everybody knew what is their duty is. But now time has changed, our Varna system is not so much applied, everybody having different kind of duties, and sometimes we have duties which do not favors the bhakti. So should we follow the Krishna's instruction and do our duty, even though if it doesn't align with the bhakti?
Yeah, you've asked a very complex question. I'll see if I can do it justice in about 4 or 5 minutes here. I won't be able to, but I'll sort of open the door for it, because this is a question I think a lot of people have when they get introduced to Krishna consciousness, especially if they know something about the whole Vedic system. Prabhupada tells us that the 4 varnas, the Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, although certainly in the age of Kali Yuga things are confused, they still exist. People are performing the duties of intellectuals, the duties of military and administrators, the duties of bankers and those who raise food and other kinds of things for people in general, and then those who don't fall into any of those classes. They're just a mixed bag. So still people do that. Of course, in Kali Yuga, there is a multiple exposure where people are not clearly in one varna or another. They're some kind of mixed thing. And in Kali Yuga, we find that people are degraded in general. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells us that the Kshatriyas, they're in the mode of passion. The Brahmanas are supposed to be in the mode of goodness. The Vaishyas are supposed to be in passion mixed with ignorance, and the Shudras in ignorance. But in Kali Yuga, almost everybody's in ignorance. So we don't really have any bona fide Kshatriyas. We don't have any bona fide Brahmanas or bona fide even Vaishyas for that matter. Mostly everybody's in ignorance. However, if one takes to the process of spiritual life, one can clean up their consciousness. And generally speaking, we have some kind of duty that we are doing with regards to a spiritual matrix of looking at things, which Prabhupada calls our Sanatana Dharma. That duties that are incumbent upon us because we're spiritual beings. Now, besides that, there's Jati Dharma, which is duties incumbent upon us because of our particular role that we play in society, which is a very different thing. And Prabhupada says sometimes these roles and duties that we have in society and the duties that we have in spiritual life, they run parallel, and sometimes they run contradictory to one another, or they run opposite to one another. And of course, just because we have spiritual duties doesn't mean that we can shirk all of our everyday duties that we have to state and country and family and all these other things. However, one thing we should know, that if we satisfy all these jati dharmas, all these duties that we have towards society, friendship, and love, if we satisfy those but we don't satisfy our sanatana dharma, we will have accomplished nothing by our life. On the other side of the coin, if we satisfy spiritual duties and we ruffle feathers and we don't actually manage to make good on all of our various social duties, essentially there won't be any real loss. It may be difficult, but there won't be any real loss. But we try to juggle as much as possible to try to keep both ends of the whole picture in focus, because it's not an easy thing. But if push comes to shove, we should recognize that ultimately, if we achieve and we manage all of our material duties nicely, but we miss out on spiritual life, our whole life is essentially a total loss. On the other side of the coin, if we perform our spiritual duties properly, or even to some extent only marginally properly, but we're doing them, then everything is gained by that. So that's why there's that verse, Devarshi Bhutaptra Ninam Pratrinam Nat Kinkaro Nayamrini Charajan Sarvatmano Yam Sharanam Sharanam Gato Mukundam Parhitya Kartam. That one who has surrendered their lives to the lotus feet of Mukunda, the giver of liberation, owes no duties or obligations to the devas, devarshi, the rishis, apta, friends, families, etc., etc. So one who has given everything to the Supreme Lord owes no duties or obligations to any of these other categories. Yet, generally, we don't just flaunt these categories, but at the same time, as Prabhupada says, one should act in society like a normal, everyday person, but saying, yes, yes, what you say is very good. While at the same time, one should be convinced that I will not lose my life to this humbug civilization that wants me to perform all these so-called duties that are neither here nor there. So we should hold very fast to spiritual duties. And what are those spiritual duties? To hear and chant, to associate with devotees, to do service. If we do these things, then ultimately we'll come out all right. And we can try to do the dance and hold on to as many of the everyday responsibilities that we can, knowing sometimes it's not going to work. But even if we forget spiritual life and just try to follow all the duties and obligations of our everyday spiritual life, we will still discover that we can't please everybody. We will come up short in somebody's book somewhere along the line. That's just the way the world works. So that's my not so short answer, but that's how I'd respond to that question. All right, so I think we are ready now, a little more than ready, for the last kirtan, and then we will, after the kirtan, go in for prasadam, which our devotees here have arranged for us so nicely, with Sasha and whoever else was the one that was cooking. We had all kinds of people cooking here. Oh, we had Elena and Glicaria. They were our cooks today. Wonderful. All right, so we're going to do some chanting, and then we'll take some prasad. And there'll be some time for other questions and discussions during the prasad time.